The thunderous crack of fireworks echoed across Mulberry Glen late into the summer night, painting the sky with shimmering bursts of red, white, and blue. I remember it vividly, how each burst scattered light across the neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses of our suburban neighborhood. It was the 4th of July, a day intended to unite us in celebration of freedom. Yet, that night was precisely when I realized my own freedom here was far from guaranteed. Standing on my porch, I savored the final explosions of color, my heart pounding with deep gratitude. The American flag I'd hung to commemorate my late father, a veteran who had served 3 tours overseas, fluttered gently in the warm breeze. For years, I displayed it as a memorial to him and to the friends he'd lost. But until that evening, I had never truly appreciated how my simple gesture of honor could become the source of so much strife. Little did I know, I was about to collide with the formidable force of an HOA officer I would later come to call HOA Karen. She was renowned around the neighborhood for her unyielding approach to community aesthetics, her eagle-eyed pursuit of perceived infractions, and her uncanny knack for twisting the rules to her own advantage. She was a middle-aged woman who carried herself with an air of authority, a stiff posture, and a gaze that seemed to demand unwavering compliance. My name is Hannah Morgan. I moved to Mulberry Glen 2 years ago, drawn by the promise of a peaceful suburban life where I could keep a small garden, feed the birds, and display my father's memorial flag in quiet remembrance. Never in my wildest dreams did I suspect that someone would label my tribute an eyesore, or that anyone would try to force me to remove it. But that's exactly what happened, and I invite you to lean in and keep listening, because the resolution of this conflict took more than just a quiet conversation or a simple apology. It became a battle of principles, patriotism, and pride in one's family heritage. I first crossed paths with our overzealous HOA official at a block party that same July. She held her head high as she marched from house to house with a small notebook in hand, jotting down remarks about everything from the spacing of fence pickets to the type of annuals people had planted in their flower beds. She wore a crisp white blouse, pressed khaki pants, and had her blonde hair pulled into the tightest bun I've ever seen. Her sharp smile carried no warmth, but instead a steely determination to impose uniformity across the neighborhood. She barely acknowledged me that day, standing in my driveway with a paper plate laden with barbecue ribs. I remember overhearing her scolding a family a few doors down about the color of their mailbox and scribbling something furiously in that little notebook of hers. A few moments later, she spotted my father's memorial flag. I saw her eyes flick upward, briefly scanning the rows of houses, and then settle on my porch. Her lips tightened, just a hair. Then she continued on her route as though she'd filed away a mental note. Something in her look told me I might be receiving a letter in the mail soon. Sure enough, a few days later, I found a folded piece of paper jammed into my mailbox with the unmistakable official letterhead of our homeowners association. It politely informed me that the oversized American flag currently displayed on my porch was in violation of the community's guidelines, specifically referencing rules about the number and size of visible flags. Attached was a set of HOA design covenants that mandated how things were supposed to look in Mulberry Glen: house color, porch railings, yard ornaments, everything. The letter also contained a not-so-subtle note indicating I should take down my display as soon as possible. Anger flared within me, but so did confusion. As far as I knew, the American flag, and particularly one flown in memory of fallen veterans, was protected from such petty demands. I'd heard about issues with HOAs in other parts of the country, but never dreamed I'd face it here. Not in a place that appeared to champion community, family values, and, on the surface, patriotism. Surely, this must be some misunderstanding. Determined to address it swiftly and diplomatically, I attended the next HOA meeting. It was held in a sterile conference room at the local community center. I walked in to find a handful of people seated in stiff chairs arranged in a loose circle. At the head of the group was none other than our self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, HOA Karen. Her real name was Lisa Davenport, but everyone privately referred to her by that dreaded moniker for her persistent complaints and haughty attitude. She sat behind a long folding table, posture perfect, greeting people with a tight smile. An array of files, notebooks, and printed community regulations were neatly stacked beside her. It was evident she relished her position. If not for the pinned-on HOA badge, you'd think she was a CEO running a major corporation. Her glasses perched precariously at the edge of her nose, and she peered at the group as if she were about to deliver a crucial verdict. I took a seat. The meeting droned on about landscaping guidelines, permissible paint colors, and the aesthetics of mailbox posts. My mind wandered. I kept glancing around, thinking that maybe someone else in the room would voice their frustration about the restrictions. But everyone either seemed resigned or simply uninterested. They just nodded their heads and accepted the pronouncements. Finally, the topic came around to the matter of unauthorized flags and yard installations, which I recognized as my reason for being there. Karen cleared her throat dramatically and read out a statement regarding uniform flag sizes. She insisted that while patriotism was encouraged, all displays must conform to the set guidelines. My eyebrows shot up. I couldn't keep silent. I raised my hand. "Yes, Hannah," she said, not even trying to hide her condescension. "I'm confused," I began, forcing myself to remain calm. "Is there a reason the American flag I've hung, in honor of my father who gave his life for this country, is considered unauthorized?" Karen's lips pressed together into a thin line. "Our HOA rules specify the dimensions for the American flag if displayed for holiday observances. Your flag exceeds those dimensions, which, according to our bylaws, disrupts the architectural harmony of the neighborhood. We also have guidelines about how long flags can remain posted after a federal holiday." I felt heat creep up the back of my neck. But this isn't just a casual display. It's a memorial. There are federal protections that guarantee I can display the flag, especially under these circumstances. I'm not violating any law, and I doubt an HOA bylaw can trump federal law when it comes to a symbol of national heritage. At that, Karen gave me the sort of tight-lipped half-smile you might give a child who just said something you deemed foolish. "Miss Morgan, the HOA rules were established with the consent of the residents here to maintain a certain aesthetic. We have a process for these things. If you want to keep that particular size and style of flag displayed permanently, you need prior approval from the community board. That's how we do things in Mulberry Glen." A hush fell over the small group. Some people shifted in their seats, looking uncomfortable. One or two glanced at me sympathetically, but no one jumped to my defense. My frustration built, and I tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm sure there are plenty of ways to show uniformity without infringing on anyone's right to honor a deceased loved one. And I guarantee you that there's a federal statute that protects the right to display our flag, particularly if it's for a veteran memorial." Karen offered another fleeting smile, this one dripping with mild contempt. "We will certainly investigate that. But for the time being, please comply with the HOA guidelines, or you risk incurring a fine." She swiftly moved on to the next topic, leaving me simmering in my seat. My protest had been brushed aside as casually as someone sweeping dust under a rug. The meeting concluded without resolution, but I knew in my gut this wasn't over. My father's memory deserved more than a bureaucratic brush-off. Over the next week, I scoured the internet, poring over legal documents and articles about HOAs clashing with residents over flag displays. I found references to the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, which prevents associations from restricting the display of the U.S. flag on residential property. Though HOAs do have some leeway on placement and size, there is a significant difference between moderate guidelines and outright prohibition. I went to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars (VFW) hall in town, hoping I might find advice from individuals who had experienced similar predicaments. The commander there, a grizzled older man named Earl Lawson, was immediately sympathetic. "You did right by coming here, Hannah," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "We've had folks in the past run into pushback from HOAs. They think they can micromanage everything. But the federal law is crystal clear about the American flag. Don't let them bully you." He introduced me to other veterans who shared stories of clashing with HOAs and how they'd fought back by citing the same federal statutes I'd stumbled upon. In many instances, they'd had to file complaints or threaten legal action. But nearly every time, the HOA had folded under the weight of public disapproval and legal precedent. I left the VFW hall energized, with photocopied documents in hand that clearly spelled out my rights. I also had the names of a few attorneys who specialized in homeowners' disputes. I hoped it wouldn't come to that, but I felt steadied by the knowledge that I had legal ground to stand on. That same evening, I decided to speak to some of my neighbors, hoping to gather support, or at least let them know what was happening. My first stop was the house of a neighbor named Tim Willis, an Army veteran himself. He'd served in Iraq and had occasionally chatted with me across our fences about gardening. I found him in his front yard, planting daylilies in neat rows. "Hey, Tim," I greeted him, a hesitant smile on my face. "Do you have a minute?" He wiped his forehead. "Sure, Hannah. Everything okay? You look a bit stressed." I told him about Karen's letter and the exchange at the HOA meeting. His eyes narrowed, and he let out a low whistle. "I've heard rumors about how strict they can get, but trying to force you to remove your memorial flag is a whole different level of nerve. My gosh, you're not doing anything wrong. They ought to be ashamed of themselves." Tim's wife, Dana, emerged with a pitcher of lemonade, overhearing the conversation. She offered me a glass and frowned. "That's just awful. This is your father's memory we're talking about. Doesn't that matter to them? They claim they're just enforcing uniformity," I replied. "But we all know there's a difference between ensuring homes meet a certain standard and disrespecting a memorial. The line's pretty obvious." Tim slapped away some dirt from his hands. "You have my support, Hannah. If they fine you, I'll pitch in. And if you need more voices at the next meeting, I'll be there." It was a relief to hear. Over the following days, I visited a few other neighbors, some of whom had never even met my father but appreciated the significance of a memorial. A handful stayed neutral, afraid of rocking the boat with the HOA. But many expressed varying degrees of support, from silent nods to outright promises to stand by me if Karen continued her crusade. When the next official letter arrived, I opened it with a trembling sense of dread. As expected, it was from the HOA, this time informing me that if the non-compliant flag was not removed within 5 days, I would incur a daily fine of $100. My blood boiled. I stared at the letter, feeling indignation course through my veins. That very evening, I hammered a stake into my lawn near the base of the porch steps, where I affixed a small sign that read, "This flag flies in honor of all who served, especially the fallen." It wasn't large or flashy, but it made my intentions clear to anyone who passed by. That was my quiet, determined response. I wasn't backing down. Late that night, I found myself outside, gazing at the flag in the moonlight. I remembered my father, the way he used to stand tall and proud in his uniform. I recalled the stories he told about the unwavering sense of duty his comrades shared. This flag wasn't just cloth and threads, it symbolized sacrifice, bravery, and a sense of belonging to something greater than ourselves. And now it had become a flashpoint for a petty power struggle with a woman who couldn't see beyond the narrow confines of her HOA rulebook. 2 days later, I got a call from Tim. "You need to come outside," he said in a hushed but urgent tone. "Karen's at your house, taking pictures." I hurried to my front door, heart pounding. Sure enough, there she was in the street, clutching her phone and snapping photos of my flag from various angles, presumably to document the violation. She noticed me almost immediately, turning toward me with that trademark, tight-lipped expression. "Is there a problem?" I asked, stepping onto my porch. She crossed her arms. "Just collecting evidence for the file. Our records need to be accurate when we impose fines. I'll be issuing a formal penalty if the flag is still up by tomorrow. I have documents that show federal law protects this display," I told her firmly. "I suggest you read them before you persist in making this personal." Her jaw tightened. "This isn't personal, Miss Morgan. I'm simply doing my duty." "It certainly feels personal," I responded, swallowing my simmering anger. "I have no issue with following rules for common areas or ensuring my home is well maintained. But I will not remove this memorial. You're overstepping your authority, and you're about to find out exactly what that means." Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched away. I could hear the rhythmic click of her shoes against the pavement, a staccato beat that resonated with her controlled fury. I retreated inside, shaking with adrenaline. It struck me that Karen was more tenacious than I'd expected. She believed wholeheartedly in the righteousness of her position. I realized then that she wasn't going to back down easily. She might have even had the misguided notion that by enforcing uniformity, she was improving the neighborhood. Still, the lengths she went to and the determination in her eyes hinted at something else, a deep-seated need for control and recognition. The next week was a flurry of stressful phone calls and legal consultations. I reached out to one of the attorneys recommended by the VFW. He assured me I had a strong case if the HOA truly intended to fine me. I also had multiple supportive neighbors who were willing to provide written statements or speak at an HOA hearing if needed. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. Official notices started arriving almost daily, citing continued noncompliance. Envelopes with the HOA's insignia lined my kitchen counter. Each letter threatened escalating fines. Some demanded removal of the sign I had placed on my lawn. Others insisted on various deadlines that contradicted each other, as though she were trying to catch me off guard. Tim texted me updates whenever he noticed her or other HOA members prowling the street, pointing at my house, scribbling notes. It felt invasive and oppressive. I found myself drawing the curtains when I saw them. My sense of peace and security slowly chipped away. This was exactly the opposite of what I'd hoped for when I moved to Mulberry Glen. A peaceful suburban life? More like living under a microscope. I won't pretend I handled it perfectly. There were evenings I sat at my kitchen table, head in my hands, wondering if it was all worth it. The stress was palpable. Yet, every time my resolve wavered, I'd remember my father's unwavering commitment. If he could endure the real hardships of deployment, then surely I could stand up to this overbearing HOA. At last, the time came for another monthly HOA meeting, a special session, actually, called specifically to address ongoing non-compliance issues. I arrived early, carrying the legal documents in my own folder of evidence. Karen was already there, setting up chairs and sipping a cup of coffee. She offered me a brisk nod but said nothing. Once the meeting started, a small group of residents showed up, some out of curiosity and others because they'd begun to resent Karen's heavy-handed tactics as well. Tim was there, sporting an Army baseball cap, and a few other neighbors who had become more vocal in their support joined us. I tried to steel myself for the confrontation that was sure to follow. Karen wasted no time. She cleared her throat, made a show of flipping through her notes, and said, "Before we address any old business, we have a pressing matter. Miss Morgan's refusal to remove a flag that exceeds our designated size limits." I stood. This is not just any flag. It's a memorial flag for my father, a fallen veteran. Under the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act and additional federal guidelines, I have every right to display it on my private property. Karen's eyes flashed. While federal law does protect the display of the American flag in general, our HOA guidelines have certain stipulations regarding its dimensions and the time frame in which it can be displayed. We do not object to patriotism, but we can and will enforce the uniform aesthetic of this community. A wave of murmurs rustled through the small crowd. I heard someone whisper, "She's gone too far." Another person said, "Let the woman honor her dad." I held up my folder. I have copies of the relevant statutes here for anyone who wants to see them, along with statements from local veterans organizations. My father gave his life for this country. I believe that grants me the right to honor him. And to be frank, I believe it's deeply unpatriotic to try to strip that right away from me. Karen's voice caught for just a moment. Then she responded, "No one is trying to disrespect your father's service. However, these guidelines exist to maintain order. If we make an exception for you, what's to stop others from displaying inappropriate or oversized flags of their own?" Tim cut in, raising his hand. "You mean flags that aren't the official flag of the United States of America? This is specifically recognized by law. It's not the same as someone flying a 20-foot banner for a sports team. This is protected." Karen shot him a glare, annoyance evident in her steely gaze. "Our guidelines do not differentiate in that manner. Any display must be submitted for approval if it exceeds the standard measurements. That's our policy." I shook my head. Is the policy more important than someone's right to honor a veteran? Or than federal law, for that matter? At that point, another neighbor, Serena, spoke up. "I've seen your father's memorial flag, Hannah. It's tastefully displayed. It's not gaudy. It doesn't clash with anything unless you're determined to see it that way." Karen pursed her lips. "We are not discussing taste here. We're discussing guidelines that every resident agreed to when purchasing property in Mulberry Glen." Anger flared in my chest. I haven't seen a single complaint from any neighbors besides the HOA. My property is well kept. I maintain the lawn. I paint the house regularly. The only difference is that I honor my father with a flag that's slightly larger than your arbitrary standard. Why is this such a personal crusade for you? Her posture stiffened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of real emotion behind her eyes, something akin to wounded pride. She inhaled, then leveled her gaze at me. "I've dedicated countless hours to this community. People think they can move in, break the rules whenever they feel like it, and that sets a precedent. If we let you keep it up without going through the proper channels, we lose credibility as an organization. Maybe if your guidelines had an exception for memorial flags," Tim interjected, "you wouldn't have to treat a fallen veteran's tribute like a nuisance." Karen glowered at him. "That's neither here nor there. The board can vote on changing guidelines, but until that happens, we must abide by them. Miss Morgan is in violation, plain and simple." and she will be fined accordingly. I felt frustration rising. Then we'll let the courts decide, I said, pulling out the attorney's business card. I've consulted a lawyer, and if you try to enforce a fine, we'll see what a judge has to say about federal laws overshadowing your guidelines. I think you'll find you're in for a losing battle and a public relations nightmare. A hush fell over the room. Karen's lips twitched as she glanced around, no doubt noticing the uneasy stares of the other residents. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, and I could see the slightest tremor in her hands. Then she cleared her throat again, flipping through her notes with practiced composure. In that case, we will table this discussion for the time being, she said, her tone clipped. I will consult our legal counsel, and we will reconvene at a future date. This meeting is adjourned. She stood abruptly, sweeping her papers into a neat pile, and left the room with long, determined strides. As the weeks stretched on, the tension in Mulberry Glen escalated. Some neighbors told me in hushed tones that Karen had tried to shame them into siding with her, hinting that if they opposed the HOA, they might find themselves under scrutiny for other violations. It was a classic intimidation tactic, and it worked on a few residents who just didn't want trouble. But a surprising number of them stood by me, outraged that the HOA would take such a stance. Social media chatter in local community groups ramped up, with more people talking about the flag controversy in Mulberry Glen. Though many posted anonymously, the commentary was largely critical of Karen's tactics. Rumor had it that Karen disliked the negative attention, especially as some local veterans began to pick up on the story. There were mentions of staging a rally at my house, of calling local news stations, of bringing in a retired general from the county next door. It was a wave of patriotic and moral support that I hadn't fully expected, but which deeply encouraged me. Every day that passed, I expected to receive an official fine or lawsuit from the HOA. But strangely, nothing materialized. Just more letters vaguely referencing my non-compliance and claiming my account would reflect the fines, but no official invoice or charges actually arrived in any verifiable form. It was as though Karen sensed that going too far, too fast, would blow up in her face. She seemed to be at a stalemate, wanting to crack down but fearful of the consequences. I occasionally spotted her walking or driving through the neighborhood, phone in hand, taking pictures of properties, mine included. The tension was palpable. One afternoon, as I was watering my garden, she slowed her SUV to a near crawl in front of my house, glaring at me through the window before speeding off. It felt ominous, like she was waiting for me to slip up. Finally, the day came when she played her trump card. A thick envelope showed up in my mailbox, stamped in bright red letters, notice of hearing. Inside, I found a formal summons to appear at a compliance hearing where the HOA board would determine the legal ramifications of my violation, including the possibility of placing a lien on my property if I refused to pay mounting fines. My hands shook as I read the words. A lien on my home, that was the nuclear option, usually reserved for extreme cases like unpaid monthly dues or serious, repeated violations. All because of a flag? The blatant disregard for basic decency took my breath away. But I also felt a surge of defiance. This was it, the final battle. Either I rolled over and removed my father's flag, or I stood my ground and faced her attempt to strong-arm me into submission. That evening, I laid out my documents in the living room, carefully organizing legal references, precedents, the letters from the VFW, the statements from neighbors. Tim and Dana came over, offering moral support and extra sets of eyes to ensure I was prepared. We rehearsed potential arguments. My heart thudded with a mix of fear and determination. The hearing took place in the same dull community center room, but this time with a far larger audience. Word had spread, and many local veterans attended out of solidarity. The air buzzed with low murmurs and tension so thick you could almost reach out and grab it. Karen and a few other HOA board members sat at a long table at the front, files spread before them. She kept glancing nervously at the crowd, her face set in grim resolve. I took a seat facing them, flanked by Tim on one side and Commander Earl Lawson, who had come from the VFW, on the other. My attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Michelle Torres, sat next to me, her expression calm but unwavering. Karen opened the hearing with a practiced monotone. We are here to address continued violations by resident Hannah Morgan, who has failed to comply with guidelines regarding the display of an unauthorized flag. Miss Morgan has also displayed signage on her property without approval. Fines have been accumulating. We will discuss the possibility of further action, up to and including a lien on her property, unless she voluntarily removes the non-compliant items. My stomach clenched. Michelle leaned forward. Ms. Davenport, We'd like to clarify for the record that Miss Morgan's flag is not unauthorized. It is, in fact, legally protected under federal statutes, including but not limited to the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. The sign she placed is a memorial sign, also protected as it relates directly to a recognized federal symbol. We have the documents here. She handed out copies to the other board members. Karen took one but barely glanced at it, as if the mere act of reading it would undermine her. Michelle continued. Moreover, we have documented proof that multiple attempts were made to inform the HOA of these protections, yet Miss Morgan has been harassed and threatened with fines and, as of now, a property lien. We consider this an overreach of HOA authority and a violation of Miss Morgan's rights. If the board persists, we'll be forced to consider legal action against the HOA. Karen's knuckles whitened on the table. She cleared her throat. As I mentioned previously, the HOA does not object to patriotic displays. However, the size of Miss Morgan's flag surpasses our guidelines. We have the right to enforce uniform standards for the sake of community appearance. Earl Lawson stood, addressing the board directly. I served this country for 30 years. I've seen countless neighborhoods across the nation honor the flag without incident. That includes flags far larger than the one Hannah Morgan flies. This is not about an unruly, unsightly display. It's about someone overstepping their bounds and ignoring the sacrifice made by our veterans. I find it appalling that this neighborhood, this association, would even consider imposing fines for such a thing. A wave of murmurs and nods rippled through the room. Karen looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the public opposition. Serena, the neighbor who'd spoken up before, rose to her feet. We want to see the HOA enforce rules that keep the neighborhood nice. Yes, but not at the cost of trampling on someone's heartfelt tribute to a loved one who died for our country. This is excessive. At least half a dozen other neighbors chimed in, echoing her sentiment. The mood in the room shifted from tense to almost rebellious. Karen's eyes darted from face to face. She took a sip of water and tried to regain control. I'm sure we all respect the memory of Miss Morgan's father. That's not in question. But the board has unanimously agreed to these regulations in the past. If Miss Morgan had submitted a request beforehand, perhaps we could have found a compromise. I interjected. I shouldn't need permission to hang the American flag, especially in memory of a fallen soldier. That's where you're fundamentally mistaken. This is not a novelty or a decoration. It's a memorial protected by law. Karen's facade cracked just a bit. Her voice wavered when she next spoke. We have to maintain the character of this community. If we allow one exception, Michelle cut her off. There is no allowing necessary. Miss Morgan's right to display the flag, particularly a memorial flag, is protected. If you continue to attempt enforcement, we will bring a civil complaint. And we will win. The media coverage alone would be catastrophic for the HOA. Are you sure you want to pursue this? A hush fell, and the board members exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, a bespectacled man named David, who I knew was on the board but rarely spoke, cleared his throat. If there is, in fact, clear legal precedent protecting this display, we might need to reconsider. The goal here isn't to bankrupt residents or undermine federal law. Exactly, another board member muttered. Karen's expression hardened. She locked eyes with David, as though silently commanding him to keep quiet. But the tide had turned. The weight of the evidence and the significant community support was too overwhelming. Tim leaned forward. What about the fines already allegedly accrued? We want to make sure Hannah isn't penalized just because she stood up for her rights. Karen's face went pale, but she forced a dry swallow and said, well, the board will have to vote on whether to waive any accrued fees. Earl piped up, vote now. Let's get this over with. David shifted uneasily, then nodded. In the spirit of fairness and the law, the board should consider dismissing all fines and dropping the lien threats. He looked at Karen. Unless we want to risk a lawsuit that will likely lose. Karen stared at her notes, refusing to look up for several long moments. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of its earlier confidence. Then I suppose we should hold a formal vote. The board members cast their votes verbally, one by one. Even those who seemed to fear Karen's wrath couldn't side with her on something that clearly flew in the face of federal law. In the end, the decision was unanimous. The fine was rescinded, all threats of liens were dropped, and the board clarified that the HOA would not prevent me from displaying my father's memorial flag. Relief washed over me in waves. People in the room clapped, a smattering of applause that crescendoed into genuine cheers. I squeezed Michelle's hand, thanking her, and turned to Tim and Earl, gratitude shining in my eyes. The tension that had been coiled in my chest for weeks finally began to unwind. Karen remained seated, her face a portrait of humiliation. The crowd's energy seemed to swirl around her, a swirl of disapproval and relief at the same time. She quickly gathered her papers, avoiding eye contact with me or anyone else. For a brief moment, I saw in her eyes something like regret, or perhaps anger at having lost. Without a word, she stood and hurried out of the room, leaving the other board members to handle the aftermath. In the days and weeks that followed, an uneasy calm settled over Mulberry Glen. My flag continued to fly, day in and day out, a proud testament to my father's service. The neighbors who had once seemed timid about siding against the HOA began to speak openly of reforms. They wanted less power in the hands of one individual and a more transparent process for making decisions. Rumor had it that Karen would soon resign from her position, though no official announcement was made. She was rarely seen strolling the streets anymore, and her trademark notes about minor infractions seemed to vanish. One pleasant Saturday morning, as I tended to the small memorial garden beneath my flag, I heard a tentative voice call out from the sidewalk. I turned to see Karen standing there, her posture slightly slumped. She wore casual clothes instead of her usual pressed attire, looking strangely ordinary. She took a few cautious steps forward. "May I speak with you, Hannah?" she asked quietly. Unsure, but curious, I nodded. She cleared her throat, wringing her hands. "I'm stepping down from the HOA soon. I want you to know it wasn't just about your flag. Sometimes I lose sight of the individual because I'm so focused on the rules. My father served, too, many years ago. I never meant," she hesitated, voice faltering. "I never wanted to make you feel like I was dishonoring your dad. Some part of me thought I was preserving order. Maybe I took it too far." I studied her face, searching for sincerity. I saw remnants of pride and maybe some shame. For a moment, empathy flickered in my own heart, realizing that beneath her rigid exterior, Karen might have been driven by her own complexities, an overzealous need for control, or maybe even some unspoken pain in her past. I nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that. I do think you took it too far, especially threatening to put a lien on my house. But I accept your apology." She exhaled, relief mingling with a sad sort of acceptance. "Thank you. And I hope you know your father's service is valued. I'm sorry for the trouble I caused." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me in a swirl of conflicted emotions. Part of me wanted to cling to the anger. Another part recognized that, for once, she'd stepped out of her self-assured persona to offer a genuine apology. In the end, I decided to let go of the grudge. Life is too short, and my father would have counseled me to forgive where possible. Not forget, mind you, but forgive enough to move forward. And so the saga concluded in Mulberry Glen. My memorial flag still waves with pride on my porch, a daily reminder of my father's courage and the sacrifices made by so many veterans. Neighbors pass by and greet me warmly, and though the HOA continues to exist, it's undergone a shifting of power that favors collaboration over tyranny. I learned a profound lesson from the ordeal. Sometimes, it takes a stubborn stand to protect what's right. Principles aren't always convenient, and fighting for them can be exhausting. Yet, in standing my ground, I discovered the strength of a community rallied around a cause worth defending, and the solace of knowing that my father's memory remained intact and honored. So, my friend, thank you for sticking with me through this turbulent tale. Take this as a reminder that a single voice, raised in honest defiance, can spark real change, even in a place that seems ruled by strict covenants and iron-fisted oversight. And never underestimate the power of justice, community, and good old American resolve. In the end, our flags, like our convictions, will keep flying high.